I would now like to introduce our Stephen Wolfe. He's a good friend of mine. He's a member of the NEC. He's also the number 3 candidate for the Northwest for the MEP list, and he is UKIP's spokesman for economics. Stephen Wolfe, thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nostar. Well, that's probably one of the only things that I ever remember from my time in Tantakellen in Aberystwyth, where I studied law. I think the others were Dim Osmugod, Dim Parcio, and Dim Mancio. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to come here tonight and speak before you. It's not my first time I've been to Anglesey. My family used to come here regularly when we were younger. I have an uncle from a Cunliffe, and I have aunties and uncles that live in Wales. But one of the main reasons I'm here is because many years ago I met Nathan campaigning incredibly hard in the Welsh Assembly elections. I remember at that time having met him, he brought along a very large yellow post bag with UKIP on it and a large number of envelopes for newspapers, which he put in the side of it, and Norman took me to the floor. I then understood later that he did 75,000 of those newspapers with many of you in this room, which I think was a tremendous achievement. And not only that, along with Arvel and others in this room, a tremendous achievement recently in the by-election here in Anglesey, where you were only 300 votes from achieving a great second place and defeating the Labour Party. And I think that shows to me what a great asset Wales has in Nathan, and certainly someone I would back and hope that we will have success in achieving our MEP position in Wales this year. And congratulations to you and your team, and I hope you do really well, because you have a wonderful asset here. Thank you very much for organising it this evening for me to come here, because I've had a wonderful meal, and you actually also managed to choose my favourite dessert in the cheesecake. Along being a Man United fan, you managed to also get the red next to it as well, which is actually perfect. A few weeks ago, I was actually at a conference. I'm actually a lawyer who works in the city. Like many people in UKIP, I actually have a day job. It isn't politics because of politics' sake. I didn't enter it because I feel that I have to. I'm doing this because there is a real passion in for my country, for my family, and for my friends, that we have to do something very important in relation to the EU. But at this conference, I happened to overhear a couple of surgeons talking about who were the best people to actually have on the operating table. And one of the surgeons said, well, I really like to have electricians on the table, because when I open them up, all the cables, all their body parts are colour-coded. Oh, that's fantastic. Well, the second surgeon said, well, actually, I quite like to have accountants, because when I open them up, all their parts are numbered. And the third of the surgeons said, well, no, actually, the easiest person to open up is a European Commissioner, because when you open them up, they have no heart, no soul, no spine, and no backbone, and you can easily interchange their head and their backside. Ladies and gentlemen, it's easy to make jokes about the European Union. It's easy to make jokes about the commissioners. We used to have that when we heard them talk about funny bananas or the wrong-shaped fruits and all the rest of it. In those days, we used to look upon the European Union as something over there. It had no impact on us whatsoever. But we know that now to be something totally different. We now know that the European Union imposes its will upon us, to every one of us in this room and every one of us in this great nation, every single day. We know that the Germans, in their own particular way of calculating, estimated that 75% of the laws made in Europe and translated here in the UK. We therefore have people making laws in a different country that impact us on an everyday basis. And for people, they didn't seem to understand or mind that for a while either, until we started to look at how it impacted us on a day-to-day basis. Here above us, as we look at the lights that are here, and then families across the country, they're worrying about their energy bills, their electricity bills. How are they going to fund them? How are they going to actually pay for those? And then they suddenly realised that £150 to £200 a year of those gas and electricity bills are caused by European regulations on green energy and green levies. Some of us may have daughters who suddenly found that their insurance bills for driving their cars have risen simply because the European Union has decided that they want equality of everybody on insurance and don't leave it to the insurance companies to decide who's the greater risk. Men, who are more likely to die earlier than women, are suddenly to find that their pension policies are actually decreasing because, again, the European Union is saying we've got to equalise pensions irrespective of whether the insurance companies make a guess. These are small points, but over a cumulative period of time, we have found that the European Union is impacting on every single part of our lives. And that wasn't how it was when I was a young man going to Aberystwyth studying law. When I first went to the law school there and I was taken on one of those first junkets, as it was to the European Union, I didn't realise how important that part was going to be to them. I turned up off a coach and I was met by a wall of smiling faces with almost impenetrable white teeth. It was almost like something like from the Stepford Sons. It was actually quite frightening in a way, as a lot of, at that time it was a lot of Irish students over there as stagiaires who were being employed by the European Union. It was an old office, and the old building then was like a cross, as Tony Benn used to say, in the centre of Brussels. They whisked us around all the buildings in Brussels. They started to say how important the European Union was because it saved us from war and tyranny. They started to say how important the European Union was because people would have lots of wealth. We would be creating jobs across the continent. We would have a land of luxury and lifestyles. And being a student who'd read an awful lot about communism, this kind of enthusiasm felt to me like it was a cult, felt to me like it was a religion. But what was worrying to me is the way that they kept on saying, we here will make it better for everybody else. Ronald Reagan used to say about the left in the United States is that they always decry that if you can give them a little bit more money and a little bit more power, they can help a lot more people. When in fact they always had a lot of money, they always had a lot of power, but the only people they helped was their own. Now that's what we see in the European Union, and it was totally different to what I was seeing. For me as a man coming from, a young boy coming from Manchester, I had a grandfather that without hesitation and without request during the Second World War went out and fought in the sands of Africa simply to defend the opportunity of his wife and his children to live in freedom in this country and defeat a European dictator. He saw many of his brothers and sisters and many of his friends die in that tragedy of the Second World War. And certainly when he came back, what did we have? We had freedom. We had democracy. We didn't have an economy that was working well, but we had something that is very important to the people of this country and very important to the very nature of who we are as British people. The belief that we should run our own lives and not have those above us controlling it for us. And with that message in my ears, and with the very limited opportunities I had, I went to university to study law, and I learnt more about the history of our nation. And amongst those I remember, and if I may quote, one of the most important things that I read in my first year. And these were, in 1688, we had a revolution where we managed to take over kings. We made the kings controlled by ourselves as a people. We made sure that kings here had to obey ourselves. And we had in our own first constitution, in the Bill of Rights, that we should say that the people of this country should choose our own governors, to cashier them from misconduct, and to frame a government for ourselves by ourselves. People in 1688 who were living mainly on farmlands, who were living in poverty, still wanted one thing: the ability to have a vote and control those rulers. But for the next hundreds of years, we never quite got it, did we? Even though Cromwell gave the new model army and we created a parliament, we still had to go out and fight for some more. Here in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, during the early 1800s, 15 men and women were killed and hundreds others shot by the army here simply because they wanted the vote. In my hometown of Manchester, we had the Peterloo massacre, where hundreds were shot and killed, and thousands by our own soldiers, simply for asking for the vote. And women were beaten outside Parliament in the early part of the 20th century, simply for asking for the vote for women. And this great nation managed to achieve the vote, where every one of us, man and woman, from the age of 18, was entitled to the vote to get rid of the people that were who were controlling us in 1969. And what did we do in 1972? We handed it to the European Union and said, you now create the laws. So was that fight for nothing? Was that struggle for people dying so that we could have the vote for nothing? I say no. I am standing here because there are others who stood here before me, others who stood before parliaments and governments and soldiers, because we have the right as people to decide our own destiny and choose those who make the rules of others. And that is why I believe that UKIP is the only party at the moment that is taking that seriously and believes in you and the people in this country. And that's why I am with them today. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a couple of other things that I think you have to look about in terms of the European Union. I often think, being in a farming area, I'm reminded of something that one person said to me about a farmer, that he saw this great big BMW coming down across the hillside, and he parked right up in front of him, and out came a very slick, tan man, and he had a wonderful kind of Italian Armani suit on, his shoes were shiny. And the man turned around and said, excuse me, if I can tell you how many cows you have in that field, can I take one for myself? And the farmer looked at him and he said, well, you know, okay, if you can do that, do that by all means. So the man pulled out a laptop, he gets his phone connected, he sends up a satellite message to a big satellite that takes a satellite image of it, it sends the image back down to his computer, he sends the computer message over to an office in Germany. In Germany it sends him back to a printer that he gets connected. He prints out a wonderful picture with all these pictures of the animals, and he says, you have 1,777 cows in that field. And the farmer said, wow, that's amazing. You're quite right. He said, okay, well, you're perfectly right. You better take one of the animals. So the man goes into the field, he struggles, and you see him pulling off this animal, opens the boot, shoves it into his sports car. And the farmer turns to him and he says, well, before you go, can I ask you one question? If I guess your job, can I have my animal back? And the man looks at him and says, of course, yes, of course, if you can do that. He says, well, what do you think I am? He said, I believe you're a member of the European Commission. He said, well, how do you tell that? He said, well, first of all, you turned up without me asking. You asked me a question for which I already knew the answer, and I didn't want you to ask that question. You used thousands of pounds of expensive equipment, £1 million of technology for something that I already knew. And you know absolutely nothing about me or farming, because that isn't a field of cattle, it's a field of sheep. And can I have my dog back, please? And ladies and gentlemen, they are so detached from us, as Nathan mentioned, that they fail to understand what is happening in their country. They may have had lofty ideals about creating a new nation, a new federation that stopped the wars in Europe. I did not want to see, and I'm sure they didn't want to see, the blood of any European slayed across Flanders or any other part of Europe anymore. But what they did in trying to create a new nation has actually created disharmony, discord, and an economic failure across Europe. I am reminded, as I said in my speech on Friday, I've often gone to Greece. At my wedding I had nearly 16 people from different nationalities all across Europe and all across the world. We have lots of friends, and for me, I used to go to Greece an enormous amount. But one thing that imparted for me the failure of the European Union and its project, and why it can no longer answer the economic questions that the people of Europe are asking, is what happened on the 12th of August of last year, in 2012. A 77-year-old man who was a retired pharmacist, stood 100 yards away from the parliament in Greece, the home of democracy, the home of demos. And to the passers-by, they overheard him saying a few words. And those words were, "I have debts. I no longer want those debts. I no longer want my family to have those debts or be passed on to them." He walked a few yards and shot himself in the head. On the steps of the parliament that was the mother of all democracies in Europe, a man lay dying because of the failure of the European Union and the austerity that they had forced upon that great nation. And in his suicide note, they mentioned that the government had taken away his hope. He'd taken away himself. And all across Europe, if you look at Europe today, because they have joined themselves into a currency in the euro that has tied that all those nations, 27 disparate nations, with different people, different businesses, different types and styles of lifestyles together into one, they've trapped them into an economic prison, where you see now 41% of young women in Portugal unemployed, and up to 200 people a day now leaving the airports of Lisbon to go to South America, where you see the unemployment rate of young people in Greece at 68%. And if you add the debt of Greece as €1 next to each other, one by one, it would go round the earth 1,800 times. It is a debt they cannot pay. If you look in Spain, where they have 50% youth unemployment, if you see the debt rising in Italy, which is just manageable enough at the moment, but they're deeply concerned that it will drag itself down. We've seen the problems that happened in my grandmother's homeland of Ireland, where they've seen people leaving, and they're actually saying, we're now starting to see an economic recovery because so many people have left Ireland. This is the danger of the European Union, the currency, and the economic failure it's created. And it's created that because they've centralized every decision and every idea that they've got. They create regulations like it's going out of fashion. We have a Professor Tim Congdon, who used to advise the government and was the economic spokesman in UKIP before me, who's made studies that are now recognized across the globe that 10% of this country's GDP, £140 billion a year, is actually costing us because of complying with EU regulations. We trade less than 48% now with the rest of Europe. But only 8% of our GDP is trade with Europe, yet 92% more, or 100% in reality, of all our businesses have to comply with European regulations. We have now settled the idea that it's perfectly acceptable to have 3.5 million people unemployed in this country, or 7%, as Carney is suggesting, as an acceptable number for unemployment, and yet we're seeing training levels decline, whilst we've had 4 million people enter this country from across the globe, including Europe, in 10 years under the Labour government. Every economist knows that if you oversupply a market with people, then the price and the wages of those people would decline, and that the living standards of those people also decline. It is what's happened in Europe, and it is what's happening here. When you hear the Labour Party decry that we want a living wage, then I suggest stop the immigration levels that they've got now, bring it to the levels that my grandmother had when she came over from Ireland, or my grandfather did from America, and have them to 30 to 50,000 a year, is one of the suggestions that we have, not 250,000, because then employers have to take people on as apprenticeships. Then employers have to train people to fill the roles, and with that comes a rise in wages naturally as the economy grows. What we're seeing in Europe is a devastation across people, and that is why in those countries the European Union is scared to death that in May the 22nd you will see a rise in parties that don't believe the European dream anymore, from France to Germany to Finland to Spain and to people in Greece. But they're more fearful of us completely here in the United Kingdom, and we should be proud of that fact. We should be proud that despite the abuse, despite the rudeness, despite all the things that have attacked UKIP, We are the ones that have raised this issue, the importance of it. And again here, I'm kind of thinking of a time when you have the two characters of Osborne and Cameron. Osborne is jogging and in his Notting Hill environment. And he comes across a little boy in the corner, and the little boy has a box, and he says to the little boy, "Excuse me, what's in the box?" And the little boy opens the box and says, "I have a kitten." And Osborne goes, "Wonderful. What type of kitten is it?" And Osborne goes, "It's a conservative kitten." And Osborne puffs up his chest. He feels really happy with himself. He jogs 2 or 3 yards before jumping into his ministerial limousine and drives him home. 4 days later, he's out jogging with David, and he sees the boy over in the corner again, and he says, "David, you're going to love this. Come with me now." He approaches the little boy, and he says, "Little boy, what's in the box?" The little boy, a little bit miffed, he says, "I told you a few days ago, I've got a kitten." "David, watch this," says George. And so, "What type of kitten is it?" He says, "It's a UKIP kitten." "So what do you mean it's a UKIP kitten? A few days ago you said it was a Conservative kitten." And the little boy turns around and says, "Yes, a few days ago it had its eyes closed. Now its eyes are wide open." And ladies and gentlemen, the eyes of this country, as of the eyes of Europe, are wide open to the problems in the economy and jobs that Europe has imposed upon itself. And they're also wide open to the three political parties in this country that no longer seem to care about the issues that matter for us. We have a new little member of UKIP, our youngest member of UKIP there. But that child has to grow up and go to schools, which we're finding in over 9% of schools in East Anglia now don't have anybody that speaks English and have hundreds of different languages in them. But even if we don't consider that a particular issue, we know that we're having problems in housing because we've got so many people here that we can't control from Europe that we're having to build housing on the green belt, affecting how planning is going on. We know how it's affecting our lighting and our electricity. We know that we've got issues when we look at our families and how are we going to save for the future when we see our grandparents and old people coming in to positions of penury. And I want to go out into this election and say, I don't want to talk about the negatives. I don't want to talk about the problems, because we already know what those problems are, and those three political parties don't have a solution to them. I want to tell them out there that if we leave the European Union, there are countries around the world that are succeeding a hell of a lot better than that. We know that Switzerland has 26 trade agreements with other countries across the world, and yet the European Union has 23. And its GDP and its GNP and every metric on economics for its people are higher than here. If you look at Hong Kong or Singapore or Australia, they all have trading agreements with other countries around the world, and they have booming economies. But they're not in a European Union. If we left the European Union, we would still be able to trade with Europe. We'd still be friends with Europe. Do any of us really believe that BMW would stop selling its cars to us here? Or any of the wine, if it was French on here, would not be French in the times going by? So when they tell us that we'd lose jobs, they're telling us an untruth, which is not too untypical when we talk about people like Nick Clegg, and I can't wait to see Nigel having that debate.
Yes, amen.
But I also wanted to tell them that we have different policies on education. When we look at our children's future, we want to say to them that we want to have a grammar school in every town because we believe in competition for our children. And there were problems with the last grammar school system, and that was because there was too few of them. But we will also need to consider other options, because not everybody wants to go to university. My cousin is an electrician. He didn't have the chance to have an apprenticeship system, and nor did he have the chance to go to a technical college like his father. And UKIP believes that we should be increasing the opportunities for technical colleges, or schools where people want to learn to sing, or learn to dance, or have different talents. I want to also talk about the way that we believe that we should be looking after the elderly in this country by controlling the costs that impact them, such as gas and electricity. Why is it that we see these ugly wind farms despoiling our land, and yet we know that every one of us are funding them for our own bills at the end of the month? Why is it people like David Cameron's father should be getting £30,000 for all the wind farms in his land, funded by everybody in this room? Why is it like people like Chris Huhn or other members of the government and Lib Dems like Tim Yeo are parts of companies that are green energy companies receiving benefits from everyone in this room through our higher bills. And I always remind myself about Chris Huhn. He used to say in his speeches, I have 3 points. But sorry, that one I always thought was always going to go down well. But he pretty much went down well anyway, didn't he? For not long enough. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to suggest to you that in this election, an election when the people of the country's eyes are wide open, where they're coming to UKIP in their droves, where in the last 6 parliamentary by-elections we've come second, where, as I say, Nathan has managed to almost defeat them here on this island, which they don't see as an opportunity for UKIP at all, where in May we managed to get over 140 new councillors, where we're already the second most important political party in Europe. On May the 22nd, we will have an election which will cause an earthquake across this country and a political divide. It will scare all of those in Parliament. It will scare all of those in Europe. And it is down to you, your hard work, and the way that you have supported this party. And I believe that if we get out in 77 more days and keep this going, we can get our country back for not only Nathan's daughter, but for my daughter as well. Thank you very much.